Today we're going to talk about what is quite possibly my all-time favorite grammar topic, which is parallel structure, because parallel structure in writing is just plain gorgeous. So tonight you'll be able to identify and write parallel structure, both when it happens within one sentence and when it happens across several sentences. So here we go. Parallel structure is when you intentionally format lists and the items in those lists in the same manner, whether, again, they're within one sentence or across several. And the big rule here is that when you're writing a list in parallel structure, don't mix tenses or other forms. With parallel structure, you're trying to be consistent. So if you say, I bought a hat, some gloves, and a coat, that list of three things is fine in terms of parallelism because all three of those have an article or pronoun and a noun. A hat, some gloves, a coat. It's not like I look at that list and said, a hat, some gloves, and coat. If I were to skip a word that was already established in a pattern, that would be bad. Or I could use infinitives with parallel structure. Dogs like to run, to swim, and to play fetch. And parallel structure can also work for gerunds and different kinds of verb tenses. My bestie is good at baking, swimming, and drawing. When we go on vacation, we will hike, ski, and skydive. During the triathlon, he biked, swam, and ran. It would be bad if I mixed verb tenses and just said he biked, swam, and will run. I can't just switch from past to future in a list like that. The reporter had to write his article quickly, accurately, and politely. So adverbs can also be part of parallel structure. If I establish a pattern with an adverb, I should finish the pattern with two more adverbs. The lazy student procrastinated and waited until the last minute. Here, I've got two different verbs, both in past tense, so it's a two-part list, which is fine, and it's also a compound predicate. But parallel structure can also work across multiple sentences. Here, you're going to see repetition of either an exact phrase or just structures or patterns of words. Here is a quick excerpt from one of Dr. King's speeches. He says, "But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination." So here he has some literal parallelism in terms of repeating the phrase 100 years later. He also has some more subtle parallel structure because he's talking about the Negro still is, or is still. And then you've got a two-part list. He's crippled by two things, the manacles of something and the chains of something. So the noun of noun. So everything he's writing is highly structured, which adds to the rhythm and the beauty of it. So why did Dr. King use parallel structure, and why do so many other writers do it? As I started to mention a minute ago, it creates rhythm in a sentence. It adds emphasis to certain words that the writer wants to highlight, and it helps certain ideas stick in the listener's memory. If a phrase is repeated often, then the audience is going to remember that that was important. But meanwhile, one thing that can come up is the controversy of parallelism versus redundancy. Writing is redundant if we say the exact same thing repeatedly for no good reason, especially with adjectives or poor synonym use. It would be bad for me to say that a student was both shy and bashful. Although shy and bashful are both adjectives, and that's technically parallel structure, shy and bashful are synonyms, and I don't need both of them. But it's parallelism if we're being both consistent and we're being intentional about it, and there's a reason for that repetition. So let's look at some more famous examples of parallel structure. these happen quite a bit in speeches, so you see them a lot in history, even since the days of the Romans, but it also happens in fiction too. Julius Caesar once said, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Past tense verbs. In one of St. Francis of Assisi's prayers, he says, "Make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith." So his example has both repeated exact phrases and a certain just structure repeating. Where there is this noun, let me sow this noun. John F. Kennedy once said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So we've got similar words being used, but he's rearranging them, and he's got an intentional structure to this sentence. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people." So, adjective, minds discuss, noun. Charles Dickens wrote a famous opening line to one of his novels, and he just started off the novel by saying, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness." And his sentence actually goes on, and he lists more and more things. In the Beatitudes, there's parallelism because Jesus Christ says, "Blessed are the something, for they will something." Like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God," etc. Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, said, "And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." So he's emphasizing what democracy means. And although Abraham Lincoln started this pattern of presidents really using parallel structure, it's still happening today. This is not just a historical old school writing concept. Barack Obama and countless other politicians still use this all the time. In one speech he said, "My fellow citizens, I stand here today humbled by the task before us, grateful for the trust you have bestowed, mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors." So here's a list of 3 things he feels: adjective 1, adjective 2, and adjective 3. And I won't read the whole thing word for word to you, but I want to show you a more extended example of what parallelism can look like. This is a chunk out of Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and his text is actually one of the most dense examples of parallelism that we have in contemporary writing. On one hand, he starts his pattern with a phrase that gets repeated, but he also uses parallelism in smaller bits as well, not just the phrase "I have a dream." It's all over his speech. He says that, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And he repeats that dream phrase more than once for emphasis. And that's important because Dr. King did not title his speech the "I Have a Dream" speech. The audience did later on, after the fact. The phrase I have a dream was so frequently repeated and so well received that that's what people remembered, and that's what it became famous for. So parallelism isn't just for the sake of being random or just for the sake of grammar. It's there to have an effect on the audience. So let's practice a little bit on a smaller scale. Tell me if these sentences correctly use parallel structure or not. Pause the video if you want to look at all 8 of them and think about it. But here are the answers. That bully is cruel, heartless, and harsh. Those are 3 adjectives, so that's just fine. Employees must do 2 things: wash their hands, put gloves back on. Those verbs are in present tense, they're fine. Princess Diana will be remembered for Here's a list of 3. Her fashion, pronoun noun, her charity work, and meeting Mother Teresa. The sentence might not sound bad, but it's not parallel structure because I've deviated from the pattern established, and now I'm saying meeting instead of her something or other. Number 4, the teacher has the responsibility of making assignments and to grade them afterward. It'd be better to say making assignments and grading them afterward. If you skip school, it can result in suspension or being put in detention. Again, this sentence is not terrible, but it's not parallel. I should just say suspension or detention. Giving is better than to receive? Well, I should either stick with gerunds and say giving is better than receiving, or stick with infinitives. To give is better than to receive. 7 is fine, and so is 8. And these are both structural examples with certain word orders being repeated, even if certain exact word choices are not repeated. I hope this was helpful to you and that you can apply this in your own writing in future pieces of fiction or essays or speeches. Feel free to rewatch the video if needed, and thanks for listening.